Thank you. Lovely to be with all of you. And I'm glad you're all here. I'm glad it's a good showing. This is one of those topics that I think is always going to be pretty relevant, especially on a college campus. You know, there's always a lot of rhetoric. There's always a lot of talk about college students and all these things. And a lot of people like to complain about how stressed college students are, right? And one thing that I've become very aware of since I've been here, working with college students, is that I was in seminary, and seminary can be a very stressful experience. But many of the young people that I've worked with here at the University of Maryland are enduring even greater stress than I did when I was in seminary, which is saying something, right? Experiencing greater anxieties than I did. And a lot of my seminary career was, thinking about celibacy and all these really heavy things, And I think that there's a lot of pressure put on college students these days, a lot more than ever before, and a lot more certainly than is necessary for your flourishing and for your health. And so this is one of the reasons why this is a talk that I'm actually very passionate about. I like to talk a lot about anxiety in confession. I like to talk a lot about anxiety in spiritual direction. And so kind of getting started, I think it's just good to just define our terms. What is anxiety? If you look at the American Psychological Association, they say that anxiety is an emotion characterized by feelings of tension, worried thoughts, and physical changes like increased blood pressure. People with anxiety disorders usually have recurring intrusive thoughts or concerns. They may avoid certain situations out of worry. What do you notice about that definition? It's long. And it's really just a bunch of descriptions. Really just a bunch of descriptors. We really have a hard time defining anxiety, right? It's a really hard thing to define, really incidentally, a hard thing to measure accurately in psychology. One of the tricky things in psychology is that we as psychologists have to, I'm not a psychologist, I'm a student. This is getting recorded, I don't want to get sued. I am a student of psychology, but psychologists need to justify their measurements. When they're researching something, they have to prove to you that they're actually measuring what they're measuring. And how do you say that you're measuring anxiety? What is anxiety? We don't even know how to define it. How can we measure it? And so they give you these things that they measure. How often are you experiencing worried thoughts? What's your blood pressure like? These are the questions they ask, and they dance around it, but it's a really hard thing to put your finger down on. Okay, so I'm going to give you a definition that is my personal definition. What is anxiety? Anxiety is stress that we borrow from the future. We look to the future, we look at the stress that we're going to undergo in the future, and we borrow it and we experience it in the present. That's what we're doing. There are tons of physiological symptoms when it comes to anxiety. This is what's going on in your bodies when you get anxious, right? And this isn't the disorder. This can be any anxiety for any of us. You don't have to have generalized anxiety disorder. You don't have to have an official diagnosis of social anxiety for this to be true. This is what's going on. Your sympathetic nervous system is getting activated. You're getting into that fight mode, flight or fight mode, right? That's what's going on there. Your cortisol levels, it's a blood cortisol. It's something they can measure. That's how one of the ways they measure stress in psychology. You can experience headaches, blood pressure. We talked about that already. Pounding heart. You can get the sense that your heart is pounding, especially when you're experiencing some acute anxiety, right? You can experience breathing patterns changing. You might start to hyperventilate. Your body's seeking oxygen because it's been in fight or flight mode for so long, right? You can experience digestive issues, decreases in sex drive if you're not a priest, right? So, I'm just kidding. That's a different talk. What happens after you get stressed? What happens after you get anxious? You become fatigued, you get exhausted, and what happens even past that? You get sick, right? Many of you may have experienced right after finals, you go home for your break, and 5 days later, you've got a cold. Why? Because your stress levels were so high that it actually torpedoed your immune system. Your immune system weakens. And I'm going to talk a little bit why that might be. Okay. There's psychological symptoms. Another word for anxiety is worry. Worry, 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 worry. If somebody says, I'm anxious, I'll ask them, what are you worried about? It helps them to focus in on, the specific reason that they're anxious. Sometimes when things stay general, they get overwhelming. You get stressed chronically. Like I said, you're borrowing stress from the future, in addition to the stress you're already experiencing. You can suffer from a sense of doom. And that sounds very, heavy, but, you suffer from that sense, I might not make it through this round of finals, And if I don't make it through this round of finals, what's going to happen? Well, then I won't get through college. If I don't get through college, I don't get the degree I want, then I won't get the job that I want. If I don't get the job that I want, I'm going to end up homeless. And you just like, it starts to build, right? You can experience panic attacks for extreme anxiety. A good way to understand what a panic attack feels like is imagine getting chased by an axe murderer. But that feeling with you just sitting in this room. That's what a panic attack feels like to somebody who's experiencing it, right? So be very gentle with people who have panic attacks. Restlessness, you lose your sleep. You become irritable. These are all things. So you have physiological symptoms, biological things that are going on when you get anxious and stressed. There are psychological things that go on when you get anxious and stressed. So getting back to this sense of borrowing stress from the future. There's this thing called load theory. Okay, so I want you to pay attention to a couple things on this table. Has anyone heard of load theory before? Yeah, do you know anything? Can you speak to it at all?
I mean, it's an engineering term.
Oh, okay. Right. I think it's an analogy that's used in many fields. And I'm using it, I'm actually pulling it. So in psychology, load theory is usually used in terms of perception and kind of early cognition. But I'm talking about it today in terms of stress and anxiety. We don't have to get into the weeds of that. It's not important. But it's just a visualization that hopefully helps you. Okay, so each of us has a capacity. Right? We all have a capacity to deal with certain amounts of stress and anxiety. Right? And imagine that this picture is your capacity to deal with stress. Okay? You can fill it up with things, right? So everything that causes us stress has load, right? And so if you're dealing with a lot, your capacity fills up. And if you're overstressed, what happens? It starts to overflow, right? And things start to break down. That's stress. Tell me things that make you anxious. Can someone tell me a thing that makes you anxious? Exams. Social situations. What's that? Sorry? The future in general. Oh, the very vague, scary concept. Yeah. Uh-huh.
I don't know, my parents are worried about me.
So your parents' anxiety has caused you anxiety. Right, absolutely. It's contagious. Yeah. Careers. Yeah. Tasks that you have to complete. Relationships. Other people's perception. Other people's opinions. It's real.
Our perception of ourselves.
Perfect. Our perception of ourselves. We're going to get more into that too.
Making decisions.
Just any little decision. Right? What am I going to watch on Netflix? Anxiety. Yeah. Student loans. Student loans. Right? I'm going to need more cups. Student loans. All right. Okay, so imagine each of these cups is filled with the load of each one of those things. And I like the fact that they're not actually filled because we don't know. We can't actually see how much load is going to be in any one stressor. But all of these cups are in the future. They're not here yet. And so what we do when we get anxious is we start to pour all of them into our capacity. Does that make sense? And what happens when we look at, just looking at this, what do we see? What's the first thing that comes to mind? A lot of cups. Is it going to fit? Right. And imagine it's less than that, and you might be wondering, it might not. That's anxiety. It's taking all of these stressors and looking at them before we even have to pour them into our capacity, even before we have to deal with them. We take them from the future and we borrow them in the present. And when I put it like that, hopefully what's coming to mind is, that's crazy, right? Why do we do that to ourselves? Well, I'm going to talk about that a little bit. Oh, what did I do with my remote? Okay. So it's that futuristic orientation. Talked about that. Why do we get stressed or anxious anyways? Why is that there? Why did God put it in us to get stressed or anxious? It's not necessarily a terrible thing to be stressed or anxious, right? It's just a terrible thing to get too stressed or anxious, right? So looking at this, you can impress your friends at your next cocktail party. You guys go to cocktail parties? Just kidding. It's the Yerkes-Dodson law, right? So there is actually, this is good to remember for finals, by the way. There is an optimal stress. And in looking at anxiety, there's an optimal anxiety. What does that look like? Well, if you're too low on the stress-o-meter, if you're too low on the anxiety meter, you're not going to get anything done. That's what apathy looks like. That's what lethargy looks like. That's what laziness looks like. That's what just like haziness. Actually, to be honest, sometimes that's what depression looks like. Not to say, lazy is a moral term. I want to strike that from the record. But sometimes the key feature of depression is, I can't get going. Right? That's the thing about depression. Sometimes it's not sadness directly. It causes sadness, but sometimes the most disturbing thing about it is, I can't get up in the morning. Right? Too high stress, your ability, your performance starts to plummet because you know, it's just thinking of a juggler, right? You got a bunch of balls in the air and you throw one more, and what happens? You throw another one, and another one, and another one. Eventually, it's too many, and what happens? He drops them all, right? That's you have too much stress, and things start to decline very fast. So there is actually this thing called the Yerkes-Dodson law, which is that there is an optimal stress. You want to be a little stressed. Why? Because it motivates you to get up and go. But there's a qualification there. Anyone heard of general adaptation syndrome? Everyone has it. We all have this syndrome. What does it start with? This is explaining how stress progresses. At first, we become alarmed, right? So think of something that stresses you out. Once you are aware that it's there, you get stressed. And then your body starts to go into that fight or flight. You start to resist. And you resist until you can't anymore, and you get exhausted. And that's in that point of exhaustion, that's where we start to torpedo our immune system. We get sick. All that. So this is by Hans Selye, and it became a very big theory in stress research, and it still is. There's one problem, though. This looks at things from the point of view of one stressor at a time. Can anyone in this room say you're only dealing with one stressor at a time? You can't, because we're also dealing with multiple stressors, more stressors. So if you look at, if you say you're dealing with one at a time, you get exhausted, you have time to recover and deal with the next one effectively. The problem is, in our modern day and age, with the number of things that are stressing us out, we get overloaded. And this general adaptation syndrome starts to break down. And our ability to recover starts to break down. Okay. So getting into the difference between anxiety and the disorder, an anxious disorder. What is the difference? As far as I can tell, it's mainly just a matter of degree. It's mainly just a matter of degree. How often, how intensely, how consistently are you anxious? Because we all get anxious, right? But if it's very, very persistent and very, very intense, then you might want to you can come and talk to me for a minute or two, and I can let you know that maybe you go see a counselor. Not to be afraid of that. But it seems to me to be mostly a matter of degree. How does it work? What is the battery? What is the fuel of anxiety? It's rumination. Rumination. And this is the specific thing that I want to talk about tonight, is the concept of rumination. Now, it's important to note, in our tradition, rumination isn't necessarily a bad thing, right? We talk about prayer and rumination, and it's a good thing. What is it? What does rumination actually mean? It's a term used for how a cow digests, right? And anyone know how a cow digests? Yeah, it's constantly like passing things from one stomach to another, and it's redigesting the same stuff over and over again to really get the nutrients, I guess. I don't know. What is rumination in a psychological sense? It's when we keep tossing these thoughts around in our heads over and over and over again, particularly the psychologically painful ones. So there is this story by a guy, what's his name? Dr. Guy Winch. You can look up his TED Talk. It's excellent, talking about mental or psychological first aid. But he tells this story about this woman who was dating this one guy for a very, very long time, and they were very, very close. She thought they were going to get married, and they end up breaking up. And she's so torn up about it that it takes her like 6, 9, 10 months before she even thinks about going on a date again, and then eventually pulls the trigger a year or two later and finally goes on her first date. It's a blind date that her friend sets her up on. And they meet, and about 10 minutes into the conversation, the guy gets up and says, "I'm sorry, I'm not interested." Right. So it gets worse. So the woman calls her friend who set them up. And her friend says, "Well, you are kind of boring. You are getting older. You are not that interesting." That would be super offensive, wouldn't it? What if I told you that was actually what the woman said to herself after? Right? I just wanted to emphasize how crazy it is that that's what we're doing when we ruminate. We wound ourselves over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. That's what's happening in rumination. We keep tossing these negative, psychologically painful thoughts over and over and over again. Why? Because we think that if we can finally wrap our minds around them, that we can get over them. Those physiological symptoms, those psychological symptoms of anxiety and stress that I went over, what does rumination do to them? They all start to go up, multiplies them, magnifies them. And how serious is rumination? I can't stress this enough. I was in a research lab for a year on suicide prevention. And this guy had developed a new way of assessing and directing the therapy of those who experience suicidal ideation. And he was very optimistic about it. And I should do another one of these. Okay, so what he found is, a decrease in depression scores is good, right? So what he found is this is what the usual, rate after time and treatment, looked like. And when he did his study, he found that it looked pretty much the same. And so he's like, well, darn it, I haven't discovered anything new. My treatment doesn't work that much better than the treatment as usual. Until a student realized that, hey, what if I took the ruminators out of this mix? What would happen? It declined a lot faster. And that showed you that the battery, the research was showing that the thing that kept suicidal ideation going most resiliently was rumination. Because once you took rumination out, people got better a lot faster. If people weren't ruminating, they got better a lot faster. So that's how serious this is, right? We think of it as this common psychological experience, and it is, but it can get out of hand very quickly and very easily. So, what are we going to do about it? Did any of you see the Christopher Robin movie? The new one? I loved it. One of my favorite lines in that was, "Christopher, what day is it?" And he says, "It's today, Pooh." And he says, "Oh, that's my favorite day." Tomorrow, when it was yesterday, was too much day for me. I love that. I love that line. A lot of wisdom in Pooh. Okay. What are we going to do? Well, I began reading, this is where we get into theology and philosophy. So, I began reading a little bit of St. Thomas this past summer. And St. Thomas has this whole section on the movements of the body and virtuous movements of the body and all these things. And he talks about this thing called eutrapelia, which is a fun word, eutrapelia. Matthew Arnold wrote, "What is eutrapelia? It's a happy and gracious flexibility. Pericles calls this quality of the quality of the Athenians, lucidity of thought, clearness and propriety of language, freedom from prejudice and freedom from stiffness, openness of mind, amiability of manners." For St. Thomas, it's this, you could translate it as serious play. Serious play. And he starts off by asking, what does the body need when it's tired? It needs sleep. It needs rest. It needs the cessation of activity. What does the soul need when it becomes tired? And for Thomas, the soul is the mind. And so the mind gets tired because it's constantly working. What does that sound like? Rumination. He calls it a tension of mind. Did you say it sounds like school? Yeah. Yeah. Rumination, school, it's all like very bad for your health. He calls it this tension of the mind. And in order to relieve the tension of the mind, in order to give the soul rest, what do? You play. That's St. Thomas's answer. I thought that was delightful, and so I started researching it more and found that psychology actually shows the same thing. The positive psychologists have this idea of flow or engagement, to be so engaged in an activity that it takes your mind up. Are there any musicians in here? I know there are musicians in here. Right. When you are playing music, have you ever been caught up in the music to where you kind of forget about everything else? That's flow. When you've engaged in a physical activity that it required enough skill and concentration that you forgot about everything else, that's flow. When you've been so engaged in a book that you're reading that you forget about the room that you're sitting in, that's flow. To be engaged so deeply that everything else falls away and disappears. That's flow engagement. And they've studied this in psychology. It's a really interesting area if you want to look into it. I have a story. My sister, I was talking at dinner, my sister taught me to box. My sister is like, Rob met her, she's like this tall, and she still frightens me. She's very, very good. But one of the reasons I got into boxing is this would be a great opportunity, right? I could get my aggression out. The stuff that's annoying me, I could just work it out on the bag, right? And just, imagine it and hit it, or imagine the person and hit that person. No, not really. I might have thought that. But the thing I found when I got there was I couldn't do that even if I wanted to, right? Because it was such an intense form of exercise that I couldn't concentrate on the things that were making me angry. And that was flow. That was engagement. C.S. Lewis has this line from one of his characters in the book Till We Have Faces about this queen who is very upset about a situation. I won't go into it, but one of her servants is a knight, and he's teaching her sword play. And so she says, "He kept me at it for a full half hour. It was the hardest work I'd ever done, and while it lasted, one could think of nothing else. I said not long before that work and weakness are comforters, but sweat is the kindest creature of the three, far better than philosophy as a cure for ill thoughts." That's a cool line, and I think it gets at this engagement. Cure for ill thoughts, a cure for anxiety. You see where I'm going with this? That if anxiety is this constant turning in on yourself and constantly tossing these thoughts around in your mind such that you can't escape that cycle of thought, then what is one good solution? One solution is to rip yourself out of that cycle when it's happening. And how do you do that? With play, with leisure, with authentic and good leisure, with authentic and good play, right? Not hours on Netflix, not hours playing video games, as wonderful as Netflix and video games can be, but an activity which will engage your soul. Right? That now you may be offering, an objection may be bubbling up in your head. You may be asking, "Father, are you not telling us to run from our problems?" Yes. That's exactly what I'm telling you. I'm telling you to run from your problems. Do it for a little while. Not for good. See, the thing is, brothers, anxiety will always be there. The stresses of life will always be there. And if all you can look at are the stresses that are waiting for you down the pike, you will have made it to the end of your life and forgotten that you should have been living. Right? If all we can do is turn these negative thoughts over in our heads just so we can barely make it and white knuckle it, we might be doing it wrong. And that's why it's so good that you're all here, because I'm sure that many of you are anxious, perhaps right now. Many of you may not have the time, so to speak, to be here, but you made the time to be here. And that's good. There will always be stress. There will always be anxiety. And that's why running from it for a short period of time every once in a while isn't a bad thing. Because guess what? You'll run back to it and it'll still be waiting there for you. So why do you have to constantly tend it? It's not a flower, it's a weed. Right? So, yes, it is going to be a little bit of escapism. It's going to be something that will tear you away from rumination. But it's not just escapism, because the ability to stop ruminating is a muscle. It's a mental muscle that you have to exercise and flex in your mind. And at some points in our lives, that muscle is weak and it needs to be stretched. And so we need to forcibly break ourselves from that rumination until we get good at breaking ourselves from that rumination. Then we don't need to do it so forcibly. Right? And it won't be as much escapism after a while. But when the anxiety is up here, the need to make time for proper leisure and play becomes way more important. It is precisely when you say the words, "I don't have time," that this is when it is most necessary. Right? When you have all the time in the world, it's the least necessary. So keep that in mind. Just make sure I'm not missing anything here. There are other ways to deal as well, to prepare yourself to play, to prepare yourself to engage in some form of leisure. There are other ways to do that, right? You have all of these stressors coming down the pike, right? What if I were to organize them, get them in line, measure them? That's possible, right? Take stock of how much is it going to take. Then I can strategically pour a little bit in at a time. But I can't do that if I don't know, right? I can't do that until I've written it down. I can't do that until I've gotten it out of here onto paper or out of here into a friend's ear. That's another powerful aspect of friendship, is a friend can help you to organize these experiences. This is what a counselor does, right? That's all counseling is. It's just organizing your experiences, organizing what's going on inside, so that way you recognize this is actually manageable. That's what a good friend will do. That's what writing these things down will do. You remove their power to make you anxious when you get them out of your head. And so you'll prepare yourself to play and to engage in some really good leisure if you can do that. So organize, get everything in order. I know, I think people talk about the devil being in the details, and some of you have heard me rail against that phrase, right? The devil's in the generalities. The devil's in the cloud. The devil's in the haze. The devil's in the darkness. The inability to see. You take stock of the details. You take stock of standing in the light and bringing these things to the light, and you rob the devil of his power. Right? The devil isn't in the details. And just one last thing. The spiritual life. So this is the priest portion. So we talked about psychology, and then we went into philosophy with St. Thomas Aquinas and Eutrapelia. Now we're in theology, and me back to my primary purpose, which is the priesthood. If rumination is a problem for you, if anxiety is a problem for you, if you plan to sit down for an hour every day in complete and utter silence with nothing else going on, how do you think that's going to go? Probably not well. Probably not well. We have to be realistic with our prayer lives, guys. We have to be very realistic with our prayer lives. And if we are constant and habitual ruminators, we're super anxious, sitting down and trying to be, Teresa of Avila or John of the Cross, is probably not going to go super well at first. So scaffold yourself. Bring the Bible. Bring your rosary. Bring that book that you love and connects you to the Lord. Right? Scaffold yourself. Don't put too much pressure on yourself. Remember that prayer is simply spending time with God and having a conversation with Him. And obviously, don't stop there. Get to work to a place where you can sit there for an hour of silence. But just recognizing that it's okay if you're not there. I'm not there. Okay? So that's the first thing. Be realistic. Reflective rumination is a good thing. Rumination in the Catholic tradition, you'll see it written about in Catholic books. And in the spiritual writers will say, this is a good thing. Why? Because to just toss things over with the Lord is not a terrible thing to do. If you want to organize your experiences with a friend, try the friend of friends. Bring it to Christ, who said himself, I have called you friends. Bounce these things off the Lord. It becomes content for your prayer. You sit down and you're like, I don't know what to pray about, but I'm super anxious. Hello? Right? Talk about what's making you anxious. And then finally, prayer itself is a form of leisure. If you read Joseph Pieper's Leisure, the Basis of Culture, in that book he says the Mass is the highest form of leisure. Why? Because the church requires you for 1 hour every week to waste time with the Lord. It's a complete waste. If you look at it from a secular point of view, if you look at it from a worldly point of view, it's a complete and utter waste of time. Obviously, through the eyes of faith, we know that it isn't. But effectively, what are we doing? We're just coming for an hour to spend some time with the Lord, to waste that time. And you may at times say to yourself, once again, those emotional cuss words, I don't have time for this. That's when it becomes most necessary. I don't have time for confession. That's when it's most necessary. I don't have time for my daily prayer routine. That's when it's most necessary. A woman came to Francis de Sales. Francis de Sales used to say everyone needed 15 minutes of mental prayer every day. This woman had like 7 children. She was so stressed. She went to Francis de Sales and says, I don't have time. I don't know how you expect me to pray 15 minutes every day. And Francis de Sales says, Madam, please stop. I do not expect you to pray 15 minutes every day. I expect you to pray 30. You need 30. 15 isn't enough. Prayer is a form of leisure. Waste some time every day with God. Bring him your anxieties. And also don't put too much pressure on yourself. And remember that if you think that I'm making all of this up, if you think modern psychology is complete nonsense, and that Thomas didn't have any idea what he was talking about, remember that Jesus said it before all of us. Do not be anxious about tomorrow, for tomorrow will be anxious for itself. Sufficient for the day is its own evil. Sufficient for the day is its own evil. And so, my brothers, go play.